Why did the world seem to hold its breath in that instant? Why did every pair of eyes fix on her, waiting for the collapse that never came? The bucket slammed down, icy and foul, drowning her in the stench of mud and stagnant water. Colonel Hargrove's hand pressed firm against the back of her neck, shoving her face beneath the surface. The silence of recruits in formation was broken only by her muffled gasps, the water splashing over the rim and soaking her uniform. Time stretched. Seconds dragged into eternity. Even Captain Rainier, standing at the edge of the circle, shifted his weight as if instinct alone urged him to intervene. Then just as quickly as it began, Hargrove yanked her upright. Filth streamed down her face, algae clinging to her hair, her eyes stinging with the sour burn of humiliation. A thin cut above her brow trickled red. Every recruit knew what was expected: tears, anger, a broken plea. Some whispered wagers had already been made. She would crack here finally and prove the colonel right. But Lieutenant Embry lock did not break. She stood, shoulders squared, posture perfect, water dripping in slow rhythm to the dirt below. She met Hargrove's eyes, unflinching, and in that unbearable silence the base seemed to shift on its axis. Permission to address the company, Colonel. Her voice was steady, calm, controlled. Hargrove hesitated, the request unexpected. He had wanted to display her collapse, not her composure. The pause stretched long enough for every recruit to sense the crack in his plan. Finally, he nodded once, curt. Granted. Embry turned to the circle of recruits, muddy, exhausted, uncertain. She felt the heat of shame pressing against her skin, but refused to let it rule her voice. "My name is Lieutenant Embry Locke," she said evenly. "Before I came here, I was an aerospace engineer. I hold patents on 3 targeting systems you may one day use in combat. I designed the guidance algorithms for the Aramis deep space mission. I didn't enlist to prove I'm strong. I enlisted to understand what strength truly means, your strength, because the systems I build must serve those who put their lives on the line." A ripple passed through the formation, confusion, disbelief, intrigue. Even Aldridge, her harshest critic, dropped his smirk for once. Hargrove's jaw tightened. But Embry wasn't finished. She pointed back toward the obstacle course looming behind them. "The colonel is right about one thing: standards matter, but standards evolve. The battlefield doesn't reward only muscle or instinct anymore, it rewards adaptability, intelligence, innovation. What I tried this morning was not rebellion, it was survival. Different doesn't mean weak." Her words hung heavy, not shouted but carried by conviction. Somewhere deep in the ranks, Recruit Y exhaled, almost a laugh of relief. The colonel said nothing, but in his silence there was both danger and acknowledgement. Hours earlier, the day had begun like any other. Camp Ridgeline wrapped in mountain fog, recruits roused by the blaring speakers, boots pounding wet gravel on the morning run. Embry had risen before reveille, her bunk already made with clinical precision. While others scrambled to assemble their gear, she sat still, eyes fixed on the notebook beneath her pillow. She had sketched through the night, diagrams covering the pages, angles, vectors, calculations. Some recruits fell asleep dreaming of home. She dreamed of problems to solve. She'd written one phrase at the bottom of the page in small block letters: adapt or fail. On the training field, Sergeant Wexler barked orders while the recruits lined up for the confidence course. 3 failures already weighed heavy on her shoulders. The others knew it. Some whispered with pity. Others snickered, betting she'd falter again. Embry crouched at the starting line, her heart steady but her thoughts racing. She wasn't like the others. They attacked obstacles with raw energy. She measured angles, searching for efficiency. She paused before the first wall, scanning its height, its supports, the mud beneath. She calculated leverage, momentum. Then she moved, deliberate, precise. From the observation platform, Colonel Hargrove's glare burned through the fog. "Too slow," he muttered. His philosophy had never changed. Break them down, strip them of individuality, rebuild them as warriors. And this woman, with her notebook and her methods, defied his creed. When she finally finished the course, Later than most, sweat streaking her face but still composed, Hargrove called her forward. "Lieutenant Locke." His voice was cold steel, front and center. She jogged to him, spine straight, eyes forward. "Standards don't bend. The enemy won't wait while you analyze your perfect angle." "Yes, sir," she replied evenly. Her mask didn't crack, not even when he circled her like a predator, his words sharp enough to cut. "In combat, hesitation kills. Your performance suggests you don't understand that." "I'll improve, sir." "You'd better. Your platoon finished 2 minutes faster." 2 minutes, Locke. In real combat, that's the difference between mission success and body bags. His words lingered even after dismissal. At the mess hall, Embry sat alone at the end of the long table, her tray arranged with geometric precision. She ate in silence, jotting notes between measured bites. Around her, the whispers continued. "She's playing chess while the rest of us are in a boxing match," Aldridge sneered. Recruit Y, seated nearby, leaned in. "Different doesn't mean wrong. She finished, didn't she?" "Barely." Y's gaze lingered on Embry, more curious than critical. There was something about the way she carried herself, something the others didn't see. That night, as the colonel's inspection raged through the barracks, his rage found her bunk. Her corners, perfect by most standards, were measured and declared 2 millimeters off. The punishment was collective. The entire platoon dragged outside, forced through grueling drills in the rain, while she remade her bed again and again. Venomous glances burned her skin, yet she said nothing. Later, when exhaustion had dropped half the platoon into restless sleep, Y caught sight of her notebook. The sketches weren't doodles but complex equations, advanced diagrams, things beyond his understanding. "What are you working on?" he asked softly. She snapped the notebook shut. "Just processing." "Those didn't look like field notes." "They're not, but they help me see patterns, problems, solutions." He studied her in the dark. She offered no more. By day 18, the storm had turned the training grounds into a swamp. Recruits slogged through mud, boots sinking deep, rifles slipping from soaked gloves. When they reached the pit, Hargrove outlined the challenge: cross, retrieve the flag, return. Standard procedure: high step through. Embry watched. The mud consumed momentum, sucked boots under, drained energy. When her turn came, she angled sideways, sliding along the sloped bank, conserving effort. She reached the flag faster than stronger recruits. Hargrove yanked her aside, fury in his eyes. "That's not the standard method." "It achieved the objective, sir." "The objective is to follow protocol. Combat isn't a science experiment." The punishment was swift. Repeat the obstacle again and again until her body trembled on the edge of collapse. That night, whispers spread in the showers, rumors of why she was here, political connections, diversity quotas, washed out of 3 other programs. None of it true, but in silence rumors grew teeth. Why defended her, Aldridge scoffed, and still she said nothing. Days later, when their fire team became lost in storm-shrouded forest, it was Embry who pulled out her notebook, charting direction from moss, wind, the faint gleam of stars. Against Aldridge's protests, the team followed and reached their target before anyone else. "You're not telling us everything," Y pressed afterward. Embry hesitated. "I have some background, positional mathematics, environmental analysis." "Some background. You just navigated a storm like it was a puzzle." "Everyone has methods." But he could see in her eyes, she carried secrets. The next morning, when Hargrove assembled the platoon, an obstacle course unlike any before towered over the grounds. Built overnight, its design was cruel. Team-based challenges demanded completion alone. He called her forward. "You've shown us your methods, Lieutenant. Now you'll show us if they serve you here." And so began the trial that would end with the bucket. She fought with every ounce of strength and intelligence she had, improvised with her belt, collapsed platforms, used momentum and leverage to do the impossible. And still, when time ran out, she fell short of the final wall. Failure. But what followed, what Hargrove intended as her destruction, was the moment that transformed everything. Because Embry Locke did not give him her collapse. She gave him her silence, her dignity, her unbroken stare. And in that silence, the recruits began to see something more than weakness, something dangerous, something powerful. That night alone in her bunk, Embry replayed it all in her mind. The bucket, the eyes of her platoon, the colonel's hand pressing down. She had wanted to rage, to cry, to demand justice, but she hadn't. Instead, she had stood. Because sometimes strength isn't loud. Sometimes it isn't violent. Sometimes it's the refusal to bow when everyone expects you to. And that refusal, quiet, stubborn, unshaken, was only the beginning. Why did the barracks feel different that night? Why did whispers soften into glances? And why did silence suddenly carry weight? Embry lay awake on her bunk, eyes open in the dark. The sounds around her, boots dropping to the floor, someone's muffled cough, the rustle of blankets, felt sharper than usual. She could still feel the grit of mud drying in her hair, the sting of the cut above her eyebrow. Every blink brought back the bucket, the weight of Hargrove's hand, the filthy water clawing into her lungs, the humiliation meant to shatter her. But something unexpected had happened. They had seen her stand. Across the aisle, Wise shifted in his bunk. He whispered just loud enough to carry. "Whatever happens tomorrow, that took guts." She didn't answer. Words weren't what mattered, not yet. The next morning, the fog clung low to Camp Ridgeline, swallowing the mountains in pale silence. Recruits formed up, boots stamping into wet gravel, rifles slung. But something had shifted. Aldridge, who had sneered at her for weeks, didn't look her way this time. Pearson, usually indifferent, gave the smallest nod of recognition. Even silence carried new meaning. Colonel Hargrove stood tall on the platform, his eyes as cold as the air. "Yesterday was not about humiliation," he declared, his voice sharp enough to slice the mist. "It was about truth. Weakness hides beneath excuses, and excuses get soldiers killed." The recruits stood rigid. No one dared breathe. Embry, eyes forward, felt his gaze linger on her. His words weren't about truth. They were about control, about reminding them that strength was only his to define. But she had shown them another kind of strength, and they had seen it. Later, during weapons drill, Embry moved with her usual precision, methodical checks, steady aim, controlled breathing. But something had changed in the way others watched her. Wise stepped closer, firing from the stall beside hers. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked between rounds. "Tell anyone what?" "That you weren't just another recruit, that you've got, well, all that." He gestured vaguely, as if patents and space missions were too abstract to name out loud on the range. Embry's eyes stayed on the target. "Because then I wouldn't know how they treat me. I'd know how they treat what they think I am. And now you know." Her round cracked through the air, piercing the paper target dead center. She lowered the weapon, her voice flat. "Now I know enough." By midday, the platoon gathered for tactical exercise. Storm clouds returned, soaking the forest in gray. Maps blurred in the rain, compasses faltered, and visibility vanished in sheets of water. Teams argued in circles. Directions failed. Morale frayed. Embry's group, Aldridge, and two others, were lost before they reached the second checkpoint. Aldridge cursed, kicking mud from his boots. "We're wasting time," he snapped. "We're done." "No," Embry said quietly. She pulled her notebook from her pack, the pages streaked with water but still legible. She scribbled quick calculations, eyes darting to the slope of the land, the tilt of moss, the direction of wind between trees. "This way." She pointed to what seemed like nothing more than tangled brush. Aldridge scoffed. "You're guessing." "No, I'm calculating. Drainage pattern plus magnetic variation. We'll intersect the ridge in 2 clicks." "You're insane." "Then stay here." She folded the notebook, tucking it away. "But I'm moving." Something in her tone, calm, certain, stilled wise doubt. "We're following her," he said, firm enough to silence Aldridge's protests. They trudged after her, and when they broke through the tree line, emerging at the checkpoint flag ahead of all other teams, silence fell heavier than the rain. Y stared at her in disbelief. "That wasn't basic land nav. What are you not telling us?" Embry's jaw tightened. "I told you, everyone has their methods." "Your methods just saved us hours." Before she could answer, Colonel Hargrove's figure emerged from the mist. His eyes burned. "Lieutenant Locke, a word." The rest of the team froze. Hargrove's tone was quiet but deadly in its restraint. They had seen this before. When the colonel marked someone, he didn't relent until they broke. And today, his mark was Embry. That night in the barracks, tension spread like smoke. No one spoke openly, but glances lingered. Some recruits who had never spoken to her murmured quiet encouragement as they passed. Others simply nodded. Even Aldridge seemed unsettled, his contempt dampened by something unspoken. Embry sat on her bunk, notebook open again, pen scratching in the lamplight. Y passed by, pausing at her side. "Tomorrow?" he asked. Her eyes lifted briefly. "Calm, steady. Observe carefully. There's always more than one solution to any problem." It was the closest thing to a warning he had ever heard from her. At dawn, the fog was gone. The sky was crystalline, sharp, exposing everything in brutal clarity. No clouds to hide behind. No shadows to soften edges. Formation 600. The company assembled, nerves taut beneath the bright sky. And then they saw it, looming at the far end of the grounds, an obstacle course like none before. Built overnight, monstrous in design, high gaps, fragile platforms, walls without holds. It was built for teams. It demanded more than one pair of hands. But they weren't to face it as teams. Colonel Hargrove's voice rang out, merciless. "Today's exercise will test your ability to function independently under extreme conditions. 8 minutes, each of you, alone." Murmurs rippled through the ranks, fear, disbelief. Hargrove's eyes cut the noise short. "Lieutenant Locke will demonstrate." The silence that followed was worse than any shout. Embry stepped forward, steady as stone. She scanned the course, her eyes flicking across impossible challenges. She already knew some of these obstacles weren't meant for one person. That was the point. Captain Renner stepped forward, voice low. "Sir, safety protocols recommend teams for obstacles 4 and 7. "Noted," Hargrove said, never looking away from Embry. "But the lieutenant prefers her own methods. Let's see how they serve her." Embry handed her watch to Y as she passed the line. "Hold this for me." Her tone was quiet, but her eyes met his, steady, unshaken. Then she stepped into position. Hargrove raised his hand. "Begin." She moved faster than anyone expected. Momentum replaced calculation. She scaled the wall with sheer drive, her hands gripping mud-slick edges, her boots scraping for hold. The rope bridge wavered beneath her weight, but she crossed with balance like a tightrope walker. Tires blurred beneath her boots. But then the fourth obstacle, a 15-foot gap, a single rope swaying above it. Normally, teammates would anchor each side. Alone, the rope swung wildly, dangerous as a blade. Embry didn't hesitate. She stripped her belt, looped it around the rope and her wrist, a makeshift stabilizer. Then she launched herself across, using her momentum to steady the swing, landing hard but safe. Gasps rippled through the ranks. Hargrove's face didn't move. 4 minutes remaining, he barked. Sweat stung her cut. Her breath came sharper now. And then obstacle 7. The suspended platforms spread too far apart to leap. Designed for human pyramids, handholds, lifts, impossible alone. Embry froze, calculating. Time bled away. Then, in one motion, she leapt to the first platform and deliberately collapsed it. Gasps broke out again as wood cracked and dropped. smashing against the others in a domino chain until they tilted into angled surfaces. "She's breaking the course," Aldridge muttered. "No," Y whispered, eyes fixed on her. "She's adapting it." 30 seconds left. The final wall loomed, 12 feet high, smooth, unyielding. Behind it the flag. Alone it was insurmountable. She backed up, ran, launched herself. Her hands caught the top edge. For one breathless moment she hung there, boots kicking against slick wood. Then her grip faltered. She slid back to the ground. "Time," Hargrove said, his voice tinged with satisfaction. "Failure." She stood at attention, her breathing controlled despite the fire in her chest. "Sir, with respect, several obstacles are designated as team challenges. Completion alone contradicts protocol. Wars aren't won by excuses, Lieutenant. When you're the last one standing, you don't get to call for help." He turned to the company, his voice sharp enough to cut air. "Gather around. Today, you will see what happens to those who don't measure up." And that was when Sergeant Wexler brought out the bucket. The stench hit first. Stagnant water, mud, rot. Recruits recoiled, some instinctively stepping back. Hargrove's words carried across the circle. "Since Lieutenant Locke thinks her brain makes her special, let's see how she thinks with her head in the muck." He grabbed her by the neck. The water closed over her face. Darkness, cold, pressure. For a heartbeat, she thought she might not come back up. But she did. She came up gasping, filthy water streaming down. Her uniform soaked, blood mingling with mud on her brow. And she stood. Not broken, not pleading, not furious. Just standing. "Permission to address the company, Colonel?" she asked, voice clear and steady. And in that silence, everything changed. Why didn't anyone move when she asked for permission to speak? Why did silence stretch like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap? Embry stood dripping, water and blood sliding down her face, her eyes fixed not on Colonel Hargrove but on the circle of recruits around her. Every one of them had expected collapse. Some had prayed for it, if only to be spared the discomfort of watching someone else humiliated. Instead, she stood unbroken. "My name is Lieutenant Embry Locke," she said, voice even, carrying through the field. "Before enlisting, I was an aerospace engineer. I designed guidance systems for the Aramis mission. I hold patents in targeting technology currently used by Special Operations." Whispers rose like static through the formation. Hargrove's brow twitched. Even Captain Renner tilted his head slightly, his composure betraying a flicker of interest. "I could have stayed in a lab. I chose not to. I chose to be here with you, to understand what you face, to build better because you deserve better." Her voice didn't crack, didn't plead. It steadied. It cut through the morning air sharper than Hargrove's bark ever had. And then she turned, walking to the tactical whiteboard near the platform. Without asking permission, she uncapped the marker and sketched the morning's course. Arrows, vectors, angles. "This design," she said, "assumes the impossible, solo completion of team obstacles. But even here, physics and leverage find solutions. Watch." Her hands moved fast. She redrew the seventh obstacle, recalculated angles, shifted load distribution. What had seemed unmovable turned, in lines and numbers, into something solvable. "We failed not because it was impossible," she explained, "but because we approached it wrong. Adaptation changes everything." Hargrove should have stopped her, should have ordered silence. But he didn't. Maybe he was curious. Maybe he was caught off guard. Maybe, for one thin second, he wanted to see where this would go. "Sir," she said finally, turning back to him, "with your permission, I'd like to demonstrate." And that was when it happened. First Y stepped forward. "I volunteer to assist." Then another. Then Aldridge, who had mocked her relentlessly, surprised even himself by stepping into line. Half the platoon followed. Captain Renner removed his cap, his voice formal but steady. "I'd like to observe this firsthand, Colonel. The lieutenant's approach merits evaluation." For a heartbeat, Hargrove's authority hung in the balance. Denying them meant crushing not just her, but the recruits' sudden, fragile unity. Granting it meant surrendering control. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed. "You have 15 minutes," he snapped, "not a second more." What happened next stunned them all. Embry didn't order by rank or strength. She studied them, then rearranged positions as though fitting puzzle pieces together. Scouts here, anchors there, agility placed before brute force. Even Aldridge, her critic, she set as communicator. "Your voice carries authority," she told him. "They'll move faster to your command than to mine." His mouth opened, closed, then stayed shut. For once he listened. The team moved differently now, not one at a time but in parallel. Where the old course demanded sequential attack, Embry's system turned it into a living organism. Scouts charted ahead while anchors reinforced. Every motion was efficient, intentional. 7 minutes later, they stood on the far side, every member carrying a flag. No one left behind, no one singled out. Silence clung heavy, then applause, not loud, not defiant. Military restraint held them back, but it was there, the pulse of something Hargrove had not planned for. Captain Renner spoke quietly to the colonel. "Sir, General Tiro would want to hear of this. The Pentagon has been pushing for this kind of evolution." Hargrove's face didn't change, but behind his eyes something cracked. He gave the smallest nod. "Make the call." By evening mess, the story had already spread like wildfire. Recruits repeated it in fragments, their voices carrying down the hall. Some exaggerated, adding weight to the moment. But the core image never shifted. Lieutenant Locke, head forced into filth, rising again with calm dignity and transforming humiliation into triumph. Embry ate in silence at her usual table, tray arranged neatly. But this time, Y joined her. Then Pearson. Then, shockingly, Aldridge slid into place across from her. "Whatever happens next," Aldridge muttered, "you showed them something, you showed us something." She looked at him only briefly. It wasn't about showing anything. It was about finding the right solution. "And if that solution embarrassed the colonel?" Y asked. "Then maybe the problem wasn't the solution," she answered softly. At that they fell quiet. That evening, Captain Renner approached her table. His tone was formal. "Lieutenant Locke, Colonel Hargrove requests your presence in the command center. 1900 hours." Speculation rippled instantly. Some thought she'd be reprimanded. Others whispered she might be dismissed. Some feared worse. When the clock struck 19, Embry entered the command center expecting only Hargrove. Instead, she found General Tiro herself at the table. The general's reputation had preceded her, sharp-minded, progressive, both admired and resented. "Lieutenant Locke," Tiro said, gesturing her to sit, "I've reviewed today's footage. Your approach interested me." Embry remained standing. "What aspects, General?" "Your integration of intellect and action, your ability to lead without stripping individuality, and most of all, your composure under duress." Tiro's eyes were piercing, yet not unkind. "Few officers could endure what you endured this morning without breaking." Embry's pulse steadied. "With respect, General, composure under duress is what training demands of us." "True, but not all training is the same." Tiro glanced briefly at Hargrove, whose silence was colder than stone. Then the general's eyes returned to Embry. "Tell me, Lieutenant, why did you leave a position of prestige to endure this?" Embry hesitated. She could have answered with patriotism, or sacrifice, or ambition. Instead, she spoke plainly. "Because systems are only as good as the people who use them, and I couldn't build for them if I didn't understand them. I came to learn the human element, not from reports, from here, from them." General Tiro leaned back thoughtful. "And what have you learned?" Embry paused. Her eyes flicked to Hargrove, then back to Tiro. "That our greatest strengths don't come from uniformity. They come from adversity, from difference. Traditional training builds traditional responses. Evolution requires disruption. For the first time, Tiro smiled faintly. Well put. The conversation stretched for an hour, ideas exchanged, observations challenged. Hargrove remained stiff, his silence unreadable. And then Tiro concluded, her words decisive. I'm establishing a new initiative here, integrated tactical development, combining intellect and physical rigor. Lieutenant Locke, I want you as its advisor. Embry's breath caught, but her voice didn't waver. Yes, General. Tiro's gaze lingered on her. You understand this will not be welcomed by all. Evolution never is. I understand. And in that moment, Embry realized something. The bucket was never the end, it was the beginning. Why did the air feel so heavy in the days that followed? Why did every hallway, every mess table, every drill field hum with the same unspoken tension? The bucket had changed everything. By the next morning, Camp Ridgeline was alive with rumor. Recruits whispered the story in fragments, each retelling sharper than the last. Some swore they saw Hargrove's hand tremble when she asked to address the company. Others claimed she had stared him down so hard he faltered. But what mattered wasn't the details. What mattered was the image. Lieutenant Locke rising from filth, calm, composed, unbroken. And that image spread faster than orders could suppress. Colonel Hargrove didn't speak of it, not to the recruits, not to his staff, but his silence was louder than shouting. His inspections became sharper, his drills more punishing. It was as if every misplaced boot, every smudge of dirt, every falter in formation was a nail he hammered down, desperate to remind them that authority belonged to him, not her. But the recruits no longer looked at him the same way. They obeyed, yes, but their eyes carried doubt, a sliver of hesitation, because they had seen something their colonel hadn't planned for. And Hargrove felt it. At mess, Embry still sat alone. She ate the same way she always had, methodically, tray arranged in precise order, bites measured and even. But the empty space around her wasn't empty anymore. Why sat nearby, pretending it was coincidence? Pearson joined without invitation. Even Aldridge, with visible reluctance, slid his tray onto her table one evening. Don't get used to it, Aldridge muttered, stabbing at his food. But what you did out there, it wasn't nothing. Embry didn't look up. It wasn't everything either. What do you mean? Y asked. She set down her fork, her tone even. It wasn't about me. It was about what they saw, about realizing strength doesn't always look the same. Aldridge shifted uncomfortably, as if the words itched beneath his skin. You talk like you're running the place. I'm not running anything, she replied. I'm just solving problems. The table fell into silence, but for the first time, she wasn't eating alone. That night Hargrove called her to his office. The room smelled of leather and old smoke, walls lined with framed commendations, medals glinting in dim light. He didn't ask her to sit. You embarrassed me, he said flatly. Embry stood at attention, her voice steady. I followed procedure, sir. You granted permission. You undermined command. I presented solutions. His eyes narrowed. Do not mistake curiosity for approval, Lieutenant. You think your intellect makes you dangerous. It makes you fragile. Out there. He jabbed a finger toward the dark window. The enemy doesn't care about your equations. They'll cut your throat before you can sketch a diagram. Embry's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. General Tiro sees potential in you, he continued. Fine, but understand this. You are still mine to command, and as long as you are here, you will play by my rules. Yes, sir. He studied her a long moment, as if searching for the crack that would make her falter. When he didn't find it, he dismissed her with a sharp wave. Days turned into a week. Training continued, but the undercurrent never left. Recruits moved differently. They whispered less, watched more. Small acts of solidarity began to surface. Someone slipped her an extra canteen during a grueling march. Another covered her flank during fire drills. Aldridge begrudgingly barked at others to keep pace with her. And yet the pressure mounted. Every success she had was met with harsher scrutiny. Hargrove shadowed her every move, daring her to misstep. He wanted to prove to them all that she was still breakable. But breakage never came. Then came the announcement. Formation was called at dawn. The recruits lined in stiff rows, breath clouding in the cold air. Hargrove stood on the platform, but beside him this time was General Tiro herself, her presence like a blade of light cutting through fog. Adaptability has always defined the warrior, Tiro began, her voice carrying calm authority. Lieutenant Locke's demonstration has shown us that strength comes not only from muscle or instinct, but from the mind's ability to adapt under pressure. A murmur rippled through the ranks. Some stared wide-eyed. Others glanced at Hargrove, searching his expression. Tiro continued, her tone unwavering. Effective immediately, Camp Ridgeline will establish the Integrated Tactical Development Unit, an initiative blending physical rigor with cognitive strategy. Lieutenant Locke will serve as technical advisor. The words landed like thunder. Recruits looked at one another, stunned. Aldridge's mouth opened, then shut. Wise's chest rose with pride he tried to hide. Embry stood motionless, the weight of every eye pressing against her. She hadn't wanted a spotlight, but she had earned one. After dismissal, whispers turned to open conversation. Some recruits approached her directly now, asking questions, even advice. Others hung back, studying her as if she had become something larger than herself. Y leaned close as they walked from formation. "You just rewrote this camp, you know." Embry shook her head. "No, the camp will resist. Change doesn't happen in a week." "Maybe not, but they'll never forget what they saw." She glanced back at the training grounds. The mud pit, the walls, the platform still tilted from her collapse. Her cut had scabbed by now, but the sting remained. Sometimes scars weren't marks of failure. Sometimes they were proof of survival. And survival was only the first step. Why did the recruits look at the course as if it had changed shape? Why did the same walls and ropes suddenly feel like something new? Because they weren't just obstacles anymore. They were symbols. By the time the Integrated Tactical Development Unit was officially announced, Camp Ridgeline had shifted in ways no one could deny. The recruits lined up at dawn as always, but their eyes no longer carried only fear of the colonel. Now, somewhere beneath discipline and exhaustion, lived a quiet anticipation. And Hargrove felt it. He didn't fight the order. He couldn't. General Tiro's authority was iron, her words unchallenged. But inside it seared him. For decades he had broken soldiers down and built them back up in one mold, unyielding, instinct-driven, uniform. Now, a lieutenant who had barely survived her first weeks was rewriting doctrine under his command. The first week of the new program was chaos. Embry drafted exercises blending physics, teamwork, and problem-solving with physical grind. She split squads by complementary skill, not just muscle. She asked questions during drills no one had asked before. What do you see? What do you predict? What's your contingency? At first, recruits stumbled. Some scoffed. Others stared blankly, conditioned to move without thinking. Hargrove stood in the shadows, arms crossed, watching with silent disdain. "You're slowing them down," he told her one evening, his voice low and sharp. "They're learning," she answered. "They're hesitating. They're adapting." Their words clashed like steel against flint, neither yielding. But results couldn't be ignored. Within days, injury rates fell. Recruits learned to conserve strength, to think under pressure instead of rushing blindly. Y flourished, bridging the gap between instinct and intellect. Even Aldridge, resistant as ever, found himself leading more effectively when given structured responsibility. One afternoon, during a simulation ambush in the forest, Hargrove watched in silence as Embry's system played out. Instead of panic, her recruits formed small cells, communicated clearly, and adapted on the move. They flanked with speed, responded to shifting conditions, and neutralized the scenario faster than any platoon had before. When the exercise ended, Hargrove stepped forward, his voice sharp but quieter than usual. "Not bad, Lieutenant. Not bad at all." Embry didn't smile, she only nodded. "They'll be better tomorrow." For the first time, Hargrove had no retort. The program grew. What began as an experiment became a rhythm. Morning drills still crushed muscles, but afternoons tested minds. Recruits solved tactical puzzles under fire, recalculated paths while sprinting with 50-pound packs, dismantled obstacles, and reassembled them into new solutions. Different doesn't mean easier, Embry reminded them often. Different means sharper. Y embraced it fully, becoming her quiet ally in every drill. Pearson found his analytical skills suddenly valuable. Even Aldridge, though still gruff, barked orders with new precision, grudgingly admitting the system gave him more authority than ridicule ever had. But it wasn't just recruits adapting. Hargrove, too, began to shift. At first he corrected harshly, barked over her instructions, tried to reclaim dominance. But as the weeks passed, he saw recruits accomplishing what they never had before. He saw them endure without breaking, solve without crumbling. He saw something that didn't weaken his camp, it strengthened it. And it unsettled him. Late one evening, Hargrove summoned her again. This time his voice carried no fury, only a weight she hadn't heard before. "You've made an impression," he said. "I didn't come here to make impressions." He studied her in silence. "You remind me of someone I knew long ago. She questioned everything too, got herself court-martialed for it. Sometimes I think she was right. Sometimes I think she got people killed." Embry didn't flinch. "Questioning doesn't kill, sir. Refusing to adapt does." His jaw worked as if chewing on words too heavy to swallow. Finally, he gave a short nod. "Report tomorrow. We'll integrate your drills into mine." Embry saluted. "Yes, sir." And that was the beginning of something neither of them admitted aloud. A fragile, uneasy alliance. By the third week, the transformation was undeniable. Camp Ridgeline felt less like a machine grinding recruits down and more like a forge, heat, pressure, shaping steel. The recruits sweated, bled, strained, but they didn't fracture. They fused. During one grueling session, Embry watched a new squad attempt the redesigned obstacle course. This time, no one stood alone at the wall. Voices called commands, hands reached out, weight was distributed, solutions improvised. They didn't beat the time limit, but every single recruit reached the final platform together. Hargrove stood nearby, arms folded. He didn't smile, but when he turned to leave, his salute to Embry was almost imperceptible. Almost. That night, Y caught her studying her notebook again, diagrams sprawling across the pages. "You ever stop?" he asked. She shook her head. "There's always another solution waiting." He smiled faintly. "You know they're calling it the lock method now." Her pen stilled. "That's not the point." "Maybe not, but it's working." Embry closed the notebook slowly. For once her eyes softened. "Then maybe," she said quietly, "it was worth the bucket." And in that moment, she understood something she hadn't when she first walked into Camp Ridgeline. Humiliation hadn't been the end. It had been the spark. And sparks, once lit, had a way of spreading. Why did General Tiro return so soon? Why did the air in the parade ground feel charged, as if something more than inspection was about to happen? The recruits stood in formation, polished boots glinting under the autumn sun. Weeks had passed since the bucket, weeks since Embry's quiet defiance. The Integrated Tactical Development Unit was no longer rumor, it was reality, and the results spoke louder than any briefing report. Completion times were up, injury rates down, retention at a record high, but beyond numbers there was something harder to measure: belief. The recruits no longer feared only failure, they believed in each other. And General Tiro had come to see it herself. She stood on the platform beside Hargrove, her presence commanding without theatrics. Adaptability, she said, her voice carrying across the parade ground, has always been the true mark of warriors. From ancient battlefields to modern conflicts, those who survive are not the strongest, but the most adaptable. The recruits listened, still silent, their discipline carved sharper by weeks of brutal training. Lieutenant Locke has shown us that strength is more than muscle or instinct. It is the capacity to observe, to calculate, to innovate under fire. For this reason, her integrated approach will be expanded. Camp Ridgeline will serve as the proving ground for the future of special operations training. Gasps rippled through the ranks. Expansion meant permanence. This wasn't a trial anymore. It was the new foundation. Embry stood at attention, every muscle taut. She hadn't sought recognition, but Tiero's words carved it into stone. Beside the general, Hargrove remained rigid, his expression unreadable. After dismissal, Tiero walked the grounds with Embry at her side. Recruits saluted, their eyes flicking with both respect and awe. "You've done more in weeks than many do in years," Tiero said, her tone almost conversational. "But do you understand what comes next?" Embry didn't hesitate. "Resistance." Tiero's mouth curved faintly. "Correct. Tradition defends itself. Some will see your methods as weakness. Others will see them as threat. But evolution always meets resistance." They stopped at the obstacle course, now redesigned under Embry's notes. Platforms angled for strategy, walls reinforced for group leverage, simulations built to force communication. "Do you believe this will hold in combat?" Tiero asked. Embry looked at the course, then at the recruits running it, faces streaked with sweat, bodies straining, voices shouting commands in unison. "Yes," she said quietly, "because survival isn't about being stronger, it's about being smarter together." Tiero nodded once, "Then make sure they never forget that." That night Hargrove summoned her again. His office was darker than usual, a single lamp casting long shadows across maps and medals. He didn't look up when she entered. "You've tied my hands," he said finally, voice low, heavy. Embry remained at attention. "Sir." "The general, the Pentagon, they've chosen your path. I spent 30 years breaking soldiers into warriors my way. And now," his words trailed, his jaw clenching. She waited. Finally his eyes rose to meet hers, and for the first time there was no fury in them, only weight. "Maybe I was wrong." The words startled her more than the bucket had. He stood, packing slowly. "You think I hate you, Locke. I don't. I hated what you represented, change, threat to order, but I've seen what your methods do. I've seen them fight, endure, survive in ways I didn't think possible." Embry's voice softened, steady. "Then why fight it?" "Because change takes pieces of us with it. And after 30 years, I don't know what's left when the old way's gone." The silence between them stretched long. Embry broke it gently. "Maybe what's left is something stronger, not less." Hargrove studied her a long time. Then with a sharp inhale he gave a short nod. "Report tomorrow. We build together." The next weeks blurred into relentless rhythm. Recruits ran drills under combined oversight, Hargrove barking form, Embry guiding adaptation. It was oil and water at times, harsh and seamless at others. But slowly, impossibly, something like respect began to form. Why noticed it first? During a team-based assault simulation, he caught the colonel watching Embry explain a solution, and for just a second, there was no disdain in his eyes, only thought. Later, Aldridge muttered under his breath, "Never thought I'd see the colonel and Locke on the same side." Y answered quietly, "Maybe that's what change looks like." One evening, Embry walked past the entrance of Camp Ridgeline. Her notebook, the one she'd hidden under her pillow weeks ago, now sat displayed in a glass case. The page open was the first sketch of her integrated approach, the same one she'd been working on the night Y had questioned her. She paused, staring at it. "You know," Y said, appearing at her side, "they're calling it the Locke method now. Rumor is Special Forces already wants to test it. Embry shook her head. It was never about my name. Maybe not, but it's about what you gave them, a way forward. She looked through the glass at her own handwriting, faint smudges of fatigue still visible. For the first time, her lips curved into the smallest of smiles. Then maybe it was worth the mud. And as night settled over the camp, she realized something. Change didn't roar. It didn't explode. Sometimes it began quietly, in humiliation, in defiance, in silence. And sometimes it grew into a legacy. Why did the recruits glance toward the reviewing stand with such disbelief? Why did the sight of Colonel Hargrove, once the embodiment of unyielding severity, suddenly strike them as unfamiliar? Because he wasn't standing against them anymore. He was standing with them. By the time the first platoon completed the integrated program, Camp Ridgeline felt like a different place. The crack of rifles still echoed at dawn, the mud still clung to boots, and drills still left bodies trembling with exhaustion. But the spirit had shifted. Failure no longer meant isolation. It meant adjustment, regrouping, another attempt. And Hargrove, impossibly, had become part of that shift. During a final field exercise, he marched alongside Embry as recruits tackled a labyrinth of obstacles designed to force rapid adaptation under simulated fire. She gave calm instructions, voice steady. He barked orders with his usual sharp edge. But for the first time, their voices didn't clash. They layered. The recruits responded to both, moving as one, sharpening under pressure rather than breaking. When they cleared the course with every flag recovered, Hargrove called the platoon to halt. He scanned their mud-streaked faces, his own expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he saluted them. The recruits froze. None had ever seen it. And then Embry, beside him, returned the salute. In the following days, the transformation spread beyond drills. The barracks once ruled by whispered mockery now hummed with collaboration. Recruits studied maps together, argued solutions late into the night, swapped strategies as readily as spare boots. Embry found herself approached more often, not with skepticism but with questions. How do you calculate angles under stress? How do you decide when to improvise? How do you know when to listen to instinct over equations? She answered simply, sometimes sketching diagrams, sometimes telling them to trust their own observations. Each time she reminded them, there isn't one way, there's your way, find it. And quietly, she realized that they were no longer looking at her as the odd recruit who scribbled equations at night. They were looking at her as something else entirely. A mentor. One afternoon, a new batch of recruits arrived. Among them was a young woman named Addison. She was smaller than most, quieter than most, and from the first drill she stood out, not because of failure but because of the way she solved problems differently. While others tried to brute force their way over walls, Addison studied the structure, searching for leverage. While others strained in silence, she whispered quick calculations under her breath. She reminded Embry of someone. After training, Addison approached hesitantly. "Lieutenant Locke, can I ask you something?" Embry nodded. "How did you find the courage that day with the colonel? Everyone talks about it, but no one explains how you did it." Embry paused, her gaze steady on the young recruit. "It wasn't courage," she said softly. "It was certainty. When you know who you are and what you bring to the mission, it's not about proving anything. It's about honoring your contribution." Addison nodded, her eyes wide. "I've always thought differently. Before I came here, I worried it was weakness." "Different isn't weakness," Embry said. "It's the reason we adapt, the reason we win." Behind them, Hargrove's voice cut through the air, but it wasn't his usual thunder. He had overheard. "The strongest warriors," he said, "aren't always the loudest. Sometimes they're the ones quietly calculating while everyone else is shouting." Embry glanced at him, surprised. He met her eyes, then nodded once before moving on. For a moment she almost smiled. Later that week, The base held its first graduation ceremony under the integrated program. Families stood at the edge of the field. The recruits, sharper and more resilient than ever, lined in precise formation. General Tiro returned, her speech measured but powerful. And then something no one expected happened. Colonel Hargrove stepped forward. He faced Embry, his salute crisp, deliberate, undeniable. "Lieutenant Locke," his voice carried across the field, "I owe you an apology. Old dogs can learn new tricks, but sometimes we need forceful instruction. I've spent 30 years building warriors one way. You've shown me the next generation will look different. And that isn't weakness, it's evolution." Gasps rippled through the ranks. The colonel, legendary for his severity, infamous for his pride, had just admitted fault. The recruits looked at Embry. She stood at perfect attention, but inside something shifted. Not triumph, not pride, something deeper. Respect. Not for herself, but for what they had all endured together. That night, as the camp settled into rare quiet, Embry walked the grounds. The mountains loomed dark against the stars, the air sharp with autumn chill. She passed the glass case at the entrance, the notebook inside now enshrined as if it were a relic. The page open was the one she'd sketched before everything changed. The integration model, lines and notes still smudged by her hand. Y appeared at her side. "You realize," he said softly, "you've changed the camp forever." Embry's eyes stayed on the notebook. "No," she whispered. "The camp changed itself, I just refused to break." He studied her for a long moment. Then, with quiet certainty, he answered, "And that's exactly why they'll remember you." The night stretched silent around them. But within that silence lived a truth stronger than any order shouted on a parade ground. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. Why did the camp sound different months later? Why did the clang of rifles, the cadence of boots, and the shouts of orders feel less like echoes of the past and more like a rhythm of something new? Because Camp Ridgeline was no longer what it had been. 6 months after the bucket, the base had transformed. The obstacle courses had been rebuilt, redesigned not just to punish but to provoke thought. Recruits still carried bruises, still collapsed in mud, still woke before dawn with lungs burning, but now their exhaustion carried purpose. They were stronger not because they had been broken, but because they had been sharpened. Embry stood at the edge of the training grounds, watching a new platoon attempt the integrated course. The recruits moved in coordinated teams, shouting commands, improvising solutions, adjusting mid-stride when obstacles shifted. She caught flashes of ingenuity everywhere. One squad turning a fallen log into leverage, another forming a human chain to redistribute weight. It was messy, chaotic, imperfect, but it worked. Beside her, Captain Renner scribbled notes. "Completion rates are up 60%, injury rates cut in half, retention, highest in program history." "And morale?" Embry asked quietly. Renner smiled faintly. "Better than I've ever seen it. Turns out people perform better when they're challenged, not crushed." Embry nodded, her gaze lingering on the recruits. One of them, Addison, the young woman who reminded her so much of herself, scaled the angled wall with a solution no one else had seen. Embry felt something stir in her chest. Hope. Later that day, Hargrove walked the perimeter of the course, his eyes scanning every movement. His presence still commanded silence, but it no longer carried only fear. He paused near Embry, watching Addison's squad dismantle part of an obstacle to rebuild it into something useful. Weeks ago, he would have roared, declared it failure. Now he simply grunted. "Not bad." Embry raised a brow. "Not regulation." "Neither was collapsing those platforms," he shot back. For once his tone wasn't cutting, almost amused. Embry's lips curved faintly. "Old dogs, Colonel." His jaw worked, but the corner of his mouth twitched into something dangerously close to a smile. "Sometimes they learn." And then he moved on, his posture no less rigid, but his silence no longer hostile. In the evenings, the camp told stories, around mess tables in bunks during late-night watches. The recruits repeated the same legend in different words. The lieutenant forced into filth who stood taller than her colonel. Each version changed details. Some made her speech longer. Others claimed the entire platoon had risen beside her. But the heart remained unchanged. Lieutenant Embry had turned humiliation into defiance, and defiance into transformation. Her name had become part of Camp Ridgeland's folklore. One evening, Embry passed the entrance hall, where her old notebook was displayed in its case. The page still open was the sketch she had drawn under dim barracks light when no one believed in her methods. Now it was preserved like scripture. Why joined her, his voice low. You know, they're calling it the lock method everywhere. Word is special forces are already adopting parts of it. Embry shook her head. It was never about creating a method with my name. Maybe not, Y said, but names stick when the idea changes things. She stared at her own handwriting behind the glass. If it changes how soldiers survive, how they come home alive, then it was worth it. At the next graduation, Embry stood beside Hargrove on the stage as the new recruits received their insignia. General Tiro addressed the assembly, her words deliberate, hopeful. The future of our fighting force will not be shaped by tradition alone, nor by intellect alone, but by their union. Today we recognize not just warriors of muscle, but warriors of mind. The applause that followed was disciplined but powerful, and when it ended, Hargrove himself stepped forward. Lieutenant Locke, he said, his voice carrying across the silent ground, I said once that hesitation kills. I was wrong. Blindness kills. You taught me that. The recruits gasped at his candor. Embry remained still, her salute crisp, her eyes unwavering. And for the first time, the colonel smiled. That night when the camp finally slept, Embry walked the grounds alone. The mountains loomed under starlight, the wind cutting cold across her face. She remembered the bucket, the filth, the sting of humiliation, and the silence afterward. It had felt like the end, but it had been the beginning. She paused at the edge of the field, listening to the faint hum of the bass, the quiet rhythm of boots, the distant call of orders. Her chest rose with steady breath, her heart calm. Because she understood now, strength wasn't in breaking others. Strength was in refusing to break yourself, and in helping others find their way to stand too. Sometimes dignity doesn't roar, it doesn't strike, it doesn't shout. Sometimes dignity simply rises, dripping, bruised, unyielding. And in that quiet act, it changes everything.